Hello and welcome to You Sew You. My name's Zoe and this is my channel all about the crafty bits and pieces I get up to. I knit, I sew, I spin on a drop spindle, I dabble in a bit of weaving from time to time and anything else that takes my crafty fancy really. Today we're talking about 5 reasons that you might be putting off making your own garments. So grab a brew, put your feet up and let's get started. To you. Today we are talking about 5 things that might be putting you off making your own garments, whether you knit or sew or crochet or however else you might make garments. I can't think of anything at the minute, but there's probably something out there I've not thought of. So these are things that I hear a lot when I talk to people about making my own clothes, and things that I may have thought about myself when I switched to making garments rather than primarily doing cross stitches and making toys and little things, that sort of stuff. So the first thing that I hear a lot, number 1 on our list of reasons why you might not have started making garments yet, is it looks really difficult. I don't know how to do it. Okay, fair point. Learning a new skill can be daunting, absolutely, and it's going to be hard to start with. However, there are tons of really good resources out there. There are online knitting and sewing classes and crochet classes. There's lots of YouTube videos out there where you can go and see how it's done. Some resources are free, some are paid for. As things are starting to open up again, your local fabric shop or yarn store may start to offer classes again in how to do these techniques, or they may be able to recommend a place to go to find out. So not knowing how to do a skill is not necessarily a reason not to get started. Learning things is good for your brain. Learning things is good for overcoming obstacles within life that just throws you a curveball. And hey, we've all had that in the past couple of years. There's also a lot of beginner-friendly patterns out there on the market. So if you have the basics of how to knit and or crochet or sew, you've learnt those skills. You may be making blanket squares. You may be making quilt hangings or little bags or cushion covers, that kind of stuff. You may have those skills already, in which case there are a lot of beginner friendly patterns out there for switching into garment making. I'm not saying beginner patterns, I'm saying beginner friendly. There's a difference. There are a lot of experienced knitters and sewers who will make beginner friendly patterns because they are more straightforward, and they quite often, because they're more straightforward in sort of styling, are easier to style when you're wearing them and easier to wear and easier to fit, that kind of thing. So don't be daunted. If you're looking at sewing in particular, I would look at people like Tilly and the Buttons, who really walks you through the process of how to put a garment together with photo instructions. She's got some books out as well as patterns. Actually, most independent designers kind of walk you through the steps a bit more than the big 4 patterns. So look for your independent designers, rather than your McCalls and Vogue and that kind of thing, because their instructions will be a little slimmer. Again, with knitting and crochet, independent designers are going to give you fuller instructions than the yarn companies, so Rowan and people like that. They're going to be basically creating a pattern to sell yarn rather than making a pattern to sell the pattern, whereas the independent designers, they're making patterns to sell the patterns. A lot of indie designers will also put up YouTube videos to show you the techniques that are included in the pattern, particularly if they're more on the unusual side. So don't be put off. Go for the independent designers if you're just starting out, because they will hold your hand a little bit more through the process, or find a class in garment making. So not knowing how to do things, it's not insurmountable by any stretch of the imagination. The resources are out there. As I said, some are paid for, some are free. So find the one that fits your budget. The second reason that I hear a lot from people who are talking to me about making their own things is that it's expensive. Buying the tools, buying the materials, can cost a lot of money, and it's just out of some people's budget. I totally understand this. When you first start thinking about a new hobby or a new craft, you want to get all of the stuff. You want to have all of the gadgets, all the things that are designed to make life a little bit easier. But you don't have to buy them all. You don't need a lot of those gadgets. Go for the highest quality that you can comfortably afford. So if that is a set of fairly cheap knitting needles and acrylic yarn, go for it. That's what I started with, mainly acrylic yarns, because I was learning in the 80s and that's what we used. I had straight needles that were given to me rather than ones that I bought. I have since bought a set of bamboo needles and metal straight needles that were inexpensive before I switched to using circulars more. It was knitting on the train to work that made me switch to circulars rather than straights because they take up less space. My circular knitting set and my sock set is expensive. My sock set is higher, so they're quite high-end brand. But my main knitting set from Knitting Garments of circular interchangeable needles was a budget brand. It wasn't an expensive high-end. It's not high, it's not Chargoo. It was a online retailer who have their own brand of knitting needles, and I used those. It's much less expensive. Again, with sewing, you don't need all of the stuff. You do not need a computerised sewing machine to get started with sewing. You don't need a sewing machine with oodles and oodles of stitches, because trust me, you won't use most of them. Most of the time, you'll be using a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. So as long as you've got those two on your sewing machine, you're fine. My first sewing machine cost me £40, and it did me about 15 years before I got a new one. And the new one was bought for me by my father and my stepmother. So yeah, you don't have to spend a ton. I don't have an overlocker. I don't have a cover stitch. You don't need them. They're nice to have, and I will at some point, I hope, be able to get one. But they're not essential. Apart from anything, you don't actually need a sewing machine to sew. There are people who make garments by hand. I'm thinking Bernadette Banner in particular, and some of the other historical costumer type YouTubers. So Bernadette Banner has done videos of making garments, historically inspired garments predominantly, but making garments by hand. Abby Cox has done videos on how to improve your hand sewing techniques. So there are resources out there to enable you to make garments by hand. Yes, it will take longer. Yes, you will probably want to be doing it during the daytime. But there is the bonus that you'll be able to do it in front of the TV because it's quieter than using a machine. And it's also a lot cheaper. So you don't have to spend a ton of money on equipment and tools. The same with your materials. You don't have to get the high-end fabrics to start off with. You're probably better off not, to be honest, because if I was starting out now and I was only using hand-dyed yarn or only using designer fabrics, that would be a lot of money. I mean, for a hand-dyed yarn sweater, you're looking at over £100 for my size, well over £100, and it's not necessary. If you choose to use non-acrylic yarns like I do, I prefer the feel of wool to acrylic, so I tend to knit with wool, as well as obviously some people have environmental concerns with acrylic. I know I do. I mean, it has its place, but not everybody wants to use it all the time. That you can get commercial wool yarns for a fraction of the cost of an indie hand-dyed yarn. Not that the hand-dyed yarns aren't worth it, they absolutely are. It takes time and effort to make them, but you don't have to buy a sweater's quantity of them. I will generally buy a single skein, maybe 2 skeins of a hand-dyed yarn, and either use it as a contrast colour or with other yarns, or for smaller projects like socks, that kind of thing. So it doesn't have to be expensive to buy your yarn. If you're sewing, it again doesn't need to be expensive to buy your fabric. You can go for brands that are not named designers. And actually, you can get fabrics that are very, very similar to the big name fabric designers for much less if you shop around a little bit. In the UK, we have a company called Pound Fabrics, and their prices start at £1 per metre. Sometimes the fabric is a little bit not quite what you're looking for, but they do also have some really good stuff. And if you're looking for polycottons and that kind of thing, they're great. It very much depends on what they've got in at the time. So they don't have as big a range as some of the other online retailers might. So yeah, shop around. Places like Minerva.com, you're going to be able to find your designer fabrics and your not designer fabrics. And look out as well for ex-designer fabrics. So fabrics that would have been used for runway collections or the big name retail brands that sell finished garments. They have stock left over of their fabric, they want to sell it. So they will pass it on to fabric retailers, and there are people who they call it dead stock, or ex-designer. So you can actually find high-end fabrics for a fraction of the price if you look around. You can also repurpose fabric from other things. We've all heard the story of the dresses made out of curtains, particularly if you see in Sound of Music, but there's no reason why you can't make things out of other things. Bed sheets make fantastic toile fabrics for mocking up your patterns and checking the fit before you go into your fancier, nicer, picked out especially for this garment fabric, which is a great thing to be doing if you are starting out. Try the patterns out first. You should be doing it when you're more experienced. I generally don't. But best practice, you'd be making mock-ups anyway, so use bed sheets, use duvet covers, use whatever you've got to hand and repurpose them for those, and then you're not spending as much. If you wanted to get an idea of how garments are constructed but didn't want to spend out on the fabric, go to a thrift shop, buy something in a larger size and repurpose the fabric. Or even in your own size, if you like the fabric. You can tailor it and to your own fit, and it's going to teach you how garments are constructed. Now, obviously there is a bit of an issue with that in terms of it does mean that people who are in larger sizes are going to have less available to them in thrift shops, so do be sensible about it. They're also a really good source for bedding actually as well, which will be good source material for you. So you don't need the most expensive stuff. Look for the beginner friendly materials. Don't get the big silks when you're first starting out. They're hard to work with. Start with a stable cotton or a poly cotton, the sorts of things that bed sheets are made out of basically. You're going to get much better results, you're going to be happier, and you can graduate onto the trickier, more expensive fabrics as you develop your skills. The third thing that people say to me when we're talking about making our own garments and getting started with that is it will take so long. We are so used to instant gratification. We are in the days of next day delivery, or if you're in a big city, same day. Can't get same day here. But we're used to being able to order things online and they come within 24 hours. Sewing and knitting does take a bit of time. That being said, there are projects that are smaller and more straightforward that will take less time. Your beginner-friendly patterns for sewing are going to take a lot less time, which is why a lot of experienced sewers will still make them if they want that instant gratification project. I can sew up a t-shirt in half a day. I generally cut out one day, sew up the next. Most of the things that I make, the sewing is done in a day, with a few exceptions for the more complicated constructions. Socks are relatively quick once you work out how to do them and get your head around do them and have a bit of experience. Hats and cowls are very straightforward and they don't take very much time. If you're using bigger needles and chunkier yarn, your project's not going to take as much time either. But this is the crucial thing for me. It's not all about getting things done straight away. Delayed gratification is actually really rewarding, and it's time that you're putting aside to focus on you. A lot of people find making their own things therapeutic. I'm not saying therapy because your garment's not going to talk back to you and give you the feedback that you'd get from a therapist, but therapeutic. And then when you're doing things by hand, so knitting or doing finishes by hand, if you choose to do so on your sewn garments, you can do that in front of the TV. You can do that whilst you're socialising with other people, particularly if it's a straightforward pattern. I wouldn't want to do anything too complicated and have a conversation, but you can do things alongside it. So they're not necessarily going to eat into your socialising time or your Netflix time. But if you can sit and binge watch a series or watch a film, then you've got time to make something if you spread it out throughout the week. So time isn't necessarily a problem. doing things slower is not necessarily a problem. And yes, it's time to focus on you, as I say. Plus, you're going to end up with something that is something you can be proud of, something that you've achieved, something that you've done yourself. And at this point of time and getting things that you can be proud of, just going to roll over into point 4 of the things that I hear about when people talk about starting garment making. And that is that you can buy it cheaper on the high street or online. And yes you can. It would cost me a fraction of the cost to buy a knitted cardigan in a high street store. But it might not be in the yarn that I like. It might not be in the colour that I like. It certainly won't be custom tailored to my body size and my body shape. These are the things that you can do with handmade, homemade garments that you just don't get off the high street. I choose my fabrics, I choose my style, I choose my fit, and I make them to suit me, to suit what I want. They are custom made garments, and you just can't buy that without spending a small fortune at a tailor's or a dressmaker's. So yes, you can get it cheaper on the high street, but it's not going to be exactly the right thing for you necessarily. It might be if you're lucky, but not necessarily. In addition, a lot of these high street retailers and online stores, there are ethical and sustainability concerns that not everybody is comfortable with. So by making your own garments, by using a slow fashion concept of making things that are exactly right for you, you're able to be a little bit more picky about where your materials are sourced from in terms of their ethical background and their sustainability than you would be if you were buying on the high street. And yeah, it's something that suits a lot of people to do it that way. Rather than putting money into these big corporations that design clothes to be replaced every season. You don't need to replace your clothes every season, and if you're making your own, trust me, you're going to want to look after them for a bit longer and get a few more years out of them. Most of my wardrobe these days is handmade. I do have some bought stuff, but even the stuff that I've bought I keep for longer than I would if I was out of habit going and regularly buying new stuff on the high street or online, because I know how things are made, I know how much time it takes to make things properly, and I know how to repair things, so when things do start to fail, then I can go in and do that. That's not to say that I don't go to those online cheap brand stores on occasion and high street stores on occasion. I do have things in my wardrobe that are from them. It's just not my entire wardrobe. And yeah, I am getting better at making my clothes last longer because I make some of my own. Okay, so the 5th and final reason that I hear for people putting off making their own garments is the amount of space that it's going to take up. And yes, there is going to be some space that needs to be dedicated to your craft supplies, whether that's a cupboard with your yarn and fabric in it or a space to sew, but it doesn't need to be a huge amount of space. Certainly not initially. Knitting and crochet is going to take up a lot less space. You don't need a big stash of yarn. Despite what you might see on some YouTube channels, it's nice to have, don't get me wrong. It is nice to have a large stash to pick from when you're choosing out a new project, rather than having to wait to be able to get to a yarn shop if you've even got one near you, or for an order to arrive. I don't have a very big stash. I have a few skeins that are waiting to be used in projects. I have a few skeins that were bought for a project that I didn't get around to making. But I don't have this big massive wall of wool taking up half a room in my house. I would like to have a room dedicated to my crafting. I don't at the moment. What does take up a bit more space is sewing if you're sewing by machine. As I said, you can make garments by hand. It takes a bit longer, but it can be done. My sewing machine is just here, just creeping into the corner of the shot. It's on a table in the corner of my living room. That's the only space that you need to be set up a lot of the time. There's this place where you store your sewing machine, and they're not that big. My sewing machine is 1.5 feet maybe wide, and half a foot deep. So it doesn't take up a huge amount of space. It can sit on the corner of the table until I need to use it, and then I bring it on the table, do my project, put it away. It's sat a bit forward at the moment because I've got some projects ready to sew up. When I'm sewing, I have my ironing board set up to the height of my table so that I can press my seams. So yeah, you just need a corner of a room really that you could use to sew. If you're sewing regularly, you will want a dedicated corner to use, but you can equally use your dining room table if you have one. Obviously you're then going to be setting up and putting away each time, but if you're not sewing regularly, that's not that much of a problem. If you're sewing every day, you're going to want a dedicated space. But it doesn't need to be massive. Much as I love looking at the craft rooms that people have set up on YouTube and all the things that they've done to make their space perfect for crafting, and much as I want to have one of those rooms, might actually manage to do it at some point, just not at the moment. It's not necessary for home sewing. It's a luxury, not a necessity, and that is the case with a lot of things around sewing and knitting. A lot of the things that are must-have items are not. For your sewing space, you're going to want some reels of cotton, you're going to want some bobbins, you're going to want some spare needles for your sewing machine if you're using one, and you're going to want a seam ripper. So one of these doodads, and your pins. You're talking about a box to store things in and your sewing machine. It doesn't need to be a huge space. So that's my explanations of why those 5 things shouldn't really be holding you back from getting started with making your own garments. I hope you found it useful and interesting. Obviously it is more geared towards you guys out there who have maybe not made that switch into garments just yet, than my more experienced viewers, but I hope you found it useful and interesting nonetheless. Obviously like and subscribe down below and ding that bell for notifications, just like all the YouTubers tell you. And let me know down in the comments what thing made you hold off on making garments the most. What was the one main reason that you were like, whoa, not going to get into that just yet? And how did you overcome it? Have you overcome it yet? Do you want to give garment making a go? Have a little chat down below. We like to see the conversation happening. So, I post videos every weekend, or at least I aim to post videos every weekend. I've only missed 1 week so far this year, so that's not bad. It's usually Friday, Saturday or Sunday that they go live. I'm hoping that as things open up I'll be able to get a more reliable schedule going, but yeah, just at the weekends at the moment. Sometimes they are videos like this, chatting to the camera, sometimes they are more focused on a specific technique, and sometimes they are more sort of what I've been making. Once a month I'll do a what I've been making podcasty type video. So that's all I have for you today. I will see you again next weekend, and until then, happy crafting and bye bye for now.